Welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Marc Ostwald, the Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International, joining us from Poland. Good afternoon, Marc.
Good afternoon.
Marc, let's kick off with some deep dive into the whole area of stimulus and sort of the other. I mean, stimulus is the nice word for the sort of beneath the surface of large amounts of debt, and we're seeing again this last month in the US another record fiscal deficit for the month in the hundreds of billions of dollars, for the year even greater. All of this debt, as we start to emerge from this COVID pandemic, we saw on the streets of London last night, people out celebrating like the end of a war. But the sober reality is there's a very large amount of debt to deal with now as we come forward. What's its impact? What's the hangover of this all on the markets, do you think, over the coming 6 months, 12 months?
I think for as long as central banks effectively, they don't call it outright monetary financing, but what they're actually doing with their quantitative easing programs is outright monetary financing. And we shouldn't sort of try and pretend, oh, but it's stimulus. Well, actually, all the borrowing is not stimulus either. All the borrowing is to make sure that the worst effects and the scars of this pandemic do not hit above all the labor market, and that's absolutely critical. How we extricate ourselves is going to be extremely complicated. It's dual aspect. First of all, at what point do central banks decide that we don't need that amount of constant stimulus? Now, we've got obviously a precedent here because we've had a lot of this in place right since the global financial crisis. The Fed had a little bit of a go at extricating itself. That proved to be very short-lived, and suddenly its balance sheet has doubled. It's more than 7 trillion.
A bit like other things in a way, Marc, like the COVID crisis was an accelerator of things already in motion, and certainly quantitative easing has been with us for a decade. It just seems like it's gone on to steroids over the last 12 months.
Absolutely, it's gone exponential. There's no question about it. So you've got that one side, and there's no record actually of anyone successfully extricating themselves from all of this. We've got a long-term example from Japan. They've never really managed to extricate themselves from that. So that's going to be a tricky task. The much bigger task is when do governments basically start to rein in all the support that they've been providing for the economy? I think the received wisdom, and I think I would definitely concur with this, is what we don't need is exercises in austerity. The main reason that governments have taken a lot of the burden of debt because it wasn't worthwhile burdening the private sector with all the debt that was going to be related to this. Otherwise, we would have just spent the whole time. Above all, we would have definitely been cutting back on jobs. We would have been cutting back on investment for a very, very, very long time, long after the worst impact of COVID's gone.
But we are seeing already, both in the US and in the UK, at least the early signs, I don't know if you want to call it austerity, but corporate tax rates climbing, or at least indications that they will climb.
Yes, we certainly are. I don't really believe that the UK is actually going to deliver on what has been outlined, particularly not as sharply, because that sort of impact will, for a country which is also going through Brexit at the same time, it's a long-term process, Brexit, and to suddenly wallop up the corporate tax rate and then find yourself less competitive with other countries, particularly in Europe, where the attractions of being in the EU are nevertheless there, regardless of what's gone on with the pandemic management. But yes, the corporate world, essentially what we're doing actually is another. You were talking about trends which were established. Yeah. It has long been acknowledged that actually a lot of, particularly the tech sector, simply does not pay enough in the way of taxes. Hopefully, this global workforce under the OECD can find some sort of way of doing this in some sort of equal way where governments can generate more tax revenue from the big international tech sector giants, be that an Amazon or a Google or an Apple, in a much more equitable way. We shall see, because I think what we've seen during the response to the COVID crisis is there's been a lot of nationalism at work, even within Europe. So we have a problem there, and it's certainly, I think the burden is on the corporate world in all of this, but I think also the burden is on governments to make sure that the real stimulus, which will come after the thing, is actually productive. And this is not about quantity. I think one of the big things is you need to spend large. No, it's not you need to spend large, you need to spend well.
We have Larry Summers, the sort of fabled Democratic Party financial advisor, former Treasury Secretary, president of Harvard, being relatively critical of the Biden administration's largesse and warning signs that it is overdoing it and flagging potential for a real threat from inflation. Your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, the threat from inflation, I think we need to be really careful here. There are two aspects to this, and they're very different pairs of shoes. We'll have pockets of inflation, not only because of base effects, but because we're going to have a very uneven recovery globally. Their country, China is well ahead, as we've already seen. The US is well ahead of Europe. The UK, we shall see what happens actually there. But it would appear with the vaccination program that they have an advantage, though we don't really know what the longer term protection is going to be offered by the vaccine, but that's a side issue. So what we're going to be doing is hitting on these pockets of lack of production. Now, there's two aspects to the lack of production. In the first place is, we just haven't got the factories up and running again, which are required, or the mines which are required for the raw materials. That will probably prove to be temporary. Those are temporary spikes. What we don't know, but we are seeing basically perhaps some good examples coming out of the auto sector with all the problems with the supply of semiconductors for the manufacturing of autos, is how much productive capacity have we lost? We know we're going to lose quite a lot of businesses. We've tried to support them. We've tried to ensure that they keep their employees, but at some point, the support for employment is going to have to be withdrawn.
Well, the tide needs to go out there, doesn't it, in order to
Yes.
really know which of these, at least in the OECD countries where most of this stimulus has taken place, what companies are ghost and not viable anymore, and which are, because the consequence of keeping alive companies that are not fit for purpose for the new digital economy may be just throwing good money after bad.
Absolutely, yeah. There's no question about that. There is we've had a process of zombification going on, above all in Europe, for a very long time. We need to actually start dealing with some of this, above all to ensure that when we come back to rely on the private sector, either private sector banks, that they're not sitting there being encouraged to carry on extending and pretending that companies are viable when they're not. But at the same time, there is a balance here to be struck between, we can't afford to have a massive spike in unemployment, because that will put pay to any post-COVID recovery. So that is the biggest challenge. Is there a formula for doing it well? No.
If you think about that, in essence, it kind of depends to an extent on what the infamous shape of this economic cycle you subscribe to. There seems to be a consensus building around the K structure, where the upper half of the K, the professional classes and the more wealthier classes, have had little interruption to their income and doing quite well, thank you very much, with record high equity markets. But the bottom half of the K, the working population in the day economy, the gig economy, and the manufacturing and leisure industry have been hit massively hard. I mean, how do you cater for both of those as you exit the pandemic?
Well, first of all, you need to put pay to the idea that there is all this pent-up demand because of all the excess household savings. This is a myth. The excess household savings are, to the whole of the economy, not to the K. And unfortunately, what you're going to find, and this is going to be the tricky part, is a lot of that excess saving is actually accruing to the most wealthy and those with the least propensity to spend. So we do need to address how we get people back to work at the lower levels in the gig economy, in the services sectors above all. And that's really where the biggest challenge lies, because we know that the services economy as was pre-COVID is not going to recover in the same way. There won't be as many jobs. There are many areas. If we are going to have a much more green recovery, then we need to governments need to be thinking about how they can quickly implement training programs and re-education, reskilling programs. And this is the biggest challenge they've got of the lot. Because if you basically do let a lot of companies which are no longer viable go, then you're going to have a lot of people who are being left behind. And we've seen this many, many times before in industrial cycles. So it's very, very complex challenge.
Do you think, as part of this coming out of COVID pandemic, or just coexisting with COVID going forward, an acceleration in the shift to the east, the shift to the Asia, where the center of gravity in the global economy now is firmly east of the Suez, not west of the Suez, and what are the ramifications for that, do you think, as we come out of this cycle?
Well, it was already a train in progress, and it is going to shift that much more sharply. I think the key to the recovery, and you're probably seeing it already, the EU is obviously the best example in this, though there are plenty of other areas, is there needs to be a flexibility and an agility, and there also has to be a buy-in for the population. And we can see, what we're getting at the moment in Europe and in the US and the UK is people protesting very heavily against lockdown restrictions. Now, what we need, and governments being very inflexible. What you've got in Asia is our problem is our legacy of the Reagan doctrine of governments are a problem, whereas in Asia, governments are the solution. And that gives them actually an ability, whether it's a command and control economy like China, or one in the ones like in Australia or South Korea, where they basically, yes, okay, we'll do whatever it takes. And they've had a much better, if there is such a thing, COVID
Does it set them up?
economy.
Does it set them up to be better capable of dealing with inflation?
Does it get, I mean, the inflation genie,
Lower labor costs and other things like that?
Well, I think the thing with lower labor costs that we're going to have to confront now is, if we are going to deglobalize, we are going to go more onshoring. One, do we have the capacity for it? Two, we can't operate on a just-in-time basis the way that most businesses have been doing. Everything's been focused on globalization, source the cheapest goods, be they raw materials or finished goods or intermediate goods, and deliver everything just in time. Well, that's not going to happen. We are going to have to shift that. I think Asia is in a better position on that front, simply because if you actually have a look, relatively speaking, if I think of the tech sector, I think of US companies and of Asian companies. And yes, there are those in the UK and in Europe, but in number terms, they're no match. And those companies, given those economies have that advantage, it is going to be proved to be quite decisive.
One of the sort of there's a number of things that have occurred this last few years, or last few months rather, as the markets have accelerated, is commodity prices as a whole have been climbing over the last 6 months. And where that goes, in a way, will dictate a lot as to where global inflation goes. Are we entering a new commodity super cycle where all boats are rising and stay inflated for a sustained period of time?
I think if anyone has a look at the long-term commodity price indices, whether it's the Bloomberg one, CRB, Goldman Sachs, you can have a look at previous big commodity cycles that we've had, and what one will see is if we're really, well, I'm not even sure we're at the foothills, we're on the molehills of this commodity price cycle. At the moment,
India perhaps standing on the threshold of 10 to 12% growth in GDP with 1.5 billion people, as China was 30 years ago. Maybe we are at the sort of foothills of an India-led commodity supercycle.
I would love that to be true. Unfortunately, there's too much which says we've been, how many times have I heard people say India's the next big, growth story? It's going to be like China in the last 30 years, very often, and it still hasn't happened. I think there is certainly a huge opportunity there. There's no question about it. I think at the moment, what our problem is we've had, agriculture is probably the best one to have a look at, because agriculture has joined in this one, in this particular commodity price rise. And agricultural commodity prices have been very depressed for a very long time, wherever you look. But most of what we've got at the moment is a function of both the African swine fever. You've got this huge production problems related to China and its huge demand in food terms. On oil, I can see a case, there's certainly going to be a case for thinking, well, what are we going to be like in terms of our use of public transport in future? Are people, because of COVID, going to be afraid to use public transport?
Well, we're seeing that in India example at the moment.
Yeah.
People are using their cars because of that.
But is that something which is going to have longevity? Well, it could certainly be sustained for 2 to 3 years. And then we have the other part of this, which is, I think, particularly important in the commodity sector and the industrial raw materials. If we are transitioning to a greener world, and basically, we've got a problem with our financing. I think people seem to forget that to get the alternative energy sector up to the sort of capacity which is provided now by hydrocarbons is going to take decades. And at the same time, we've got this mantra going on about we mustn't fund carbon emission industries because it's bad. But we can't stop doing that. And if we do, actually, the end result is it will be funded by the private equity sector. Prices will skyrocket, literally skyrocket, because we're basically not funding. We already have a legacy problem in the oil sector, which I don't think people really quite from the 2014 oil price crash. The fact of the matter is, the upstream and downstream investments by the oil sector, because of the long period of subdued oil prices, in some cases very weak oil prices, has meant that there hasn't been a lot of investment. And we need that investment at least for the next 10 to 20 years to produce.
Well, a lot of that is going to have to be carried by the national oil companies, it would seem, as the international oil companies have very publicly cut their capex significantly in the last 12 months and have made announcements of their intentions to withdraw quite far back from the expenditure needed for exploration and development of new oil resources.
Yes, exactly. But the transition here is going to be extraordinarily complex. I don't think if we're just talking about it, let's keep it down at the simple level. Autos, right? Very simple. When are we actually going to have autos which are of the Ford or Volkswagen or Peugeot or Toyota variety, or I should say Nissan, something cheap vehicles for the average man in the street? We're still quite a long way from that. When are we actually going to have it? It's all very well saying we don't want to have all these emissions. We want, and it's all very well to say people should use more public transport, but people are going to be afraid of using. A lot of people are going to be afraid of using public transport.
Well,
so
it's certainly when you have all of these new elements coming out of the gig economy or out of the COVID pandemic into the new economy, as we talked about earlier, remote working. Do you need to be in a car? So many unknowns there. The other big issue coming out of the COVID pandemic has certainly accelerated through the last year has what seems to be an increasing standoff between the West and China. We've seen in recent weeks alone the sanctioning. EU and the US have sanctioned Chinese officials. They've responded with the sanctioning of EU officials. Clearly, every day nearly now, there's another story of some either proxy or direct face-off between the US, EU partners and China. Uh, where is that going? And is this a Cold War, do you think, where countries and companies are going to have to choose sides? How do you see it playing out in the coming 6-12 months?
I think it is probably the issue of the moment. I think one probably can elevate this, because during the Trump era, it really wasn't a case of the US versus China. Now we're transitioning this to what one might call NATO plus Japan against China, and in broader terms, actually, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which no one ever talks about enough. This alliance between Russia and China, it's not only defense related, it is also strategic economically. What we've got really is a battle for hegemony of the world. I'm not really sure it's necessarily what one would call a Thucydides trap, but it is about hegemony. Well, we've got a problem here because we've been preaching to, particularly to the underdeveloped parts of the world, well, we can give you a better deal. So, to Africa and Latin America, I think of particularly, and to parts of Asia. Well, they've not actually had a lot out of this. So there are, this is going to be actually quite pivotal for the way the world goes forward, because as much as they may like the idea of what's Western ideals, perhaps what China has on offer, whether it's New Silk Road, New Silk Belt and Road, or something else, is up for debate. And I think we stand in the West and saying, well, we have a much better system, we have a freer system. Yes, we do. But what are we actually going to offer in return? And for a lot of these countries who, over the past, in the post-war period, actually haven't seen that much change out of the so-called development funds that have been funneled their way, they will have a stark choice to make. And it really will decide a lot of the success here. The only good thing I would say is that at least under the Biden administration, we have something far more cohesive. In a certain sense, it's a negative because it raises tensions. The other thing, I think, in terms of Cold War talk, I wouldn't necessarily want to call it a new Cold War, but I think everyone needs to be reminded, we had the tech boom because the Cold War ended. That funneled a lot of the investment in technology and made it public, because prior to that, pretty much anything which was a technological development was a national security issue.
Well, I suppose the ultimate challenge, if you like, that differentiates this period, perhaps at least at the moment, from the Cold War, is that the Chinese economy is heavily integrated into the global economy, none more so, as you say, than in technology, but also supply chains is a big one, whereas the Soviet Union and the West was quite a separate economic world, and it didn't have that. So divorce was not so complicated. Divorce now would be hugely complicated.
Oh, massively complicated. I think we've got, there's another aspect. We talk about what China supplies us, but what about the demand that we expect from China? It's not whether we're willing to supply it. It's actually whether a country, a lot of countries in Europe are hugely dependent on Chinese demand. You can't say, oh, well, we're going to...
Most notably, the biggest economy, Germany.
Yes, absolutely. They can't suddenly shut her off. Secondly, in terms of supply, it's all very well, but if we're going to develop alternative supply chains, in quality terms, you suddenly have to, you're having to reassess everything. If you are going to create redundant supply lines, which a lot of people have suggested because of all the squeezes that we saw as a result of COVID, that people should have alternative sources for things, that costs money. There are CFOs out there who are going to say, right, you want more storage space. I'm going to have to account for it in accounts. We need to devote more of our capital. So we've got less for CapEx. We've got less for employee earnings, less for bonuses. There's a real battle royal going to be going on here. And hopefully the confrontation at the moment won't escalate to a level, because otherwise we will stop the global economy. I wouldn't say dead in its track, but the recovery is not going, once we've got through the post-COVID demand squeeze, it could actually stop quite rapidly, and then we'll have to face off against all the big mountain of debt.
And it does, I mean, it does strike me that there is so many incidences growing. Taiwan, every day there's a different idea of a skirmish. The South China Sea, the issues that while nobody would want things turning hot, the potential for a mistake to be made in all of those different theaters would seem to be growing every day. And once a mistake is made, you never know what the outcome of that is. But we must wrap up now, Marc. We could be going down this path, and we will be again and again, given we're in the very early stages of coming out of the pandemic forest. But Marc Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International, thank you so much for your time today and joining us on Halftime Talk.
Pleasure.